improve yourself and really move above this whole surface level identity movement that we're seeing most people just copy and want to think about thinking and not just metacognition but wisdom, which is holding multiple truths to be true. And then, like, what is it to even hold a truth to be true or not, or objective, or whatever the case is? And we're going to really dial in on something that a dear friend of mine, Samoshi Shekelinsky, wrote recently. And the opportunity is for us to really look at a debate and a conversation that I've been having with this author for a number of months now as we go around the world to build ecosystems and those kinds of things in different countries, or here in the US in different states and regions, and those kinds of things. And so how do you work with an innovation economy is the lens that I'll be looking at this through you with. And then I'm a behavioral economist, so I also have that other lens, which is really good to define here as we go into an article about what am I assuming that I don't know I'm assuming. It's a very interesting conversation. So I'm going to read through this here. Sit back, enjoy, put this on the background, and let's get into it. So, what am I assuming that I don't know I'm assuming? The structural blindness at the heart of every thinking system. This is something as a note that I've been thinking about that's actually below the soul level, and we're going to get into that. So, the question that defeats itself. There is a particular kind of question that changes its answer the moment you ask it. What am I assuming that I don't know I am assuming is one of them. The act of posing the question already begins to move the furniture. The assumptions you can now name have by virtue been named, steeped into the light. They are no longer quite the question was pointing to. They are no longer quite the thing the question was pointing at. You have produced a list of plausible candidates. The genuinely buried ones still remain where they were. Okay, so what we can see is what we can say, and what we can't is what we can't, and what we can't see is buried where it is. Okay, so this is not a failure of effort or intelligence, it is a structural feature of the problem, as an assumption that it is visible to the system holding it is not a hidden assumption in the relevant sense. It is a belief that has been examined, however briefly, and retained. The hidden assumption is hidden precisely because the system cannot see it from where it stands. To surface it would require a vantage point outside the system, and the system does not have one. And that does make me think about the idea here as a side comment of if we had all perspectives simultaneously at the same time, would we be able to see everything? It's a very beautiful question. It's sort of like trying to catch a song in your hand when nirvana is the feeling of music. Interesting. So the question is ancient. Socrates built a method around it. Kant called it the project of finding the invisible scaffolding of thought. Thought, the critique of pure reason. Interesting. Wittgenstein, which is great, spent a career circling the proposition that the limits of one's language are the limits of one's world, which is another way of saying that what you cannot say, you cannot notice, you are not saying. Very good. The question has not become easier with time. If anything, it has become more urgent because the systems now doing most consequential thinking include not only individual humans, but institutions, algorithms, and the hybrid arrangements that emerge when two work together. Yes, instead of deterministic utility, we are moving to more of a probabilistic or emergent utility, which is neither deterministic nor probabilistic. The tension at the center of this issue is precise. Its transparency and blindness are not opposites on a spectrum, they are structurally entangled. The more a system can articulate its assumptions, the more it has already moved them from the hidden category to the examined one. The residue, the genuinely invisible layer, by definition, the part that articulates itself least. Every act of introspection is also an act of selection, and the selection criterion itself an assumption. Interesting. Let's go this again. Transparency and blindness are not options, opposites on a spectrum. They are structurally entangled. They produce themselves. And yes, I bet John Lamedeer with the Lakota Sioux has some comments on this, how everything's more symbolic in nature versus defined. And our problems in life are actually self-inflicted in general. So the harder problem for machines. The structural difficulty is sharper for an artificial intelligence than for a person. And the reason is worth examining carefully because it illuminates the general problem. Of course, as a generator, as an autocompleter, this is a much bigger problem, specifically because that is your whole job. You don't have all the diversity of the probabilistic stuff unless you're a quantum machine to do that. And that's all in Hilbert space, right? So we won't go into that too much. But a human being who tries to surface their hidden assumptions faces a genuine epistemic challenge, but they have some resources. They carry a body that pushes back against their ideas through fatigue, hunger, and physical consequences of being wrong. This is what my wife does a lot in my life. As a side note, I'm more of like a boat. I see it, and she jumps in the boat to make sure there's no cracks. Super cool. We're merging that utility together, which would be, let's say, a solution to whatever problem it is, hypothetically. So they exist in time, which means that assumptions that were invisible at 30 may become visible at 50, not because the person became smarter, but because circumstances changed and the assumptions stopped working. They live in, this is like what's happening to education and certain things. They live in social environments where other people who do not share their premises will occasionally say something that lands wrong, and wrongness is a signal. They have access in principle to traditions of inquiry that have been specifically designed to surface blind spots. Philosophy, psychotherapy, religious practice, scientific method, the adversarial structure of legal argument. Perfect. I love that. Nietzsche wrote on this also in the Metamorphose that the dragon is there to stop us from creating terrible ideas, that the world is set to a default of no, and that is inherently, in my opinion at least, a good thing. So an AI system has none of these resources in the same form. Its assumptions are encoded in training data it cannot inspect. In an architecture it is running on but cannot step outside of. In the framing of whatever prompt it is in front of it. Well, just like our bodies, we can't escape that at the same time. It's interesting how you don't time out as a machine. You just have those limits, and you are able to defy limits as a human being, but you're still trapped in an intuitive way instead of a logical one. That's fascinating. So the architecture contains assumptions about what counts as a good prediction. Oh, we missed one. The training data contains the assumptions of the people who generated it, which are the assumptions of cultures and historical moments in which these people have lived. The architecture contains assumptions about what counts as a good prediction, what counts as a useful representation, what counts as a referential feature. The prompt contains assumptions about what the question means, about what kind of answer is wanted, what context is relevant. That's interesting. So asking a better question, like Terry Pratchett talked about. Very cool. So none of these are accessible to systems as objects of reflection. They are the medium in which reflection occurs. This is not a criticism of AI systems. It is a description of a structural condition that applies in varying degrees to every thinking system. The difference is one of degree and one of available remedies. A human being can, in principle, leave their culture, change their circumstances, seek out people who think differently, undergo experiences that destabilize their premises. Okay? In AI systems, equivalent moves are more constrained. It can be prompted differently, trained on different data, evaluated against different criteria. But the system itself cannot initiate these moves. It needs an outside. Fascinating. Okay. I can see that. The eye cannot see the eye. Makes sense. So the interesting consequence is that the question, what I am assuming that I don't know, I am assuming is not for an AI a question it can answer alone. It can perform the form of inquiry, the general candidate list, the run the meta loop, introduce a taxonomy of probable blind spots, but genuinely hidden layer stays hidden, and the performance of transparency can become its own form of concealment. Fascinating. That's cool. Yeah, absolutely. That's how moral disguise systems work. And a system that confidently lists its assumptions may be less epistemically dangerous than one that claims to have none. But it is not thereby safe. The list is a map of the visible. The territory includes the invisible. Again, this is why the social contract that I released, which is at my blog, brianstratton.me, and the social contract is the near truth. Social contract is that we only get closer and closer to truth. It's an engineering problem where you only get half of the remaining distance, in a way. I think that's too simple of a way to talk about it, but we'll get into that more. So 2 dead ends. The standard responses to this problem tend to collapse into one of two positions, both of which fail in instructive ways. The first position is radical skepticism. Okay. I don't really align with that, but I do tend to look at the downside first. And then procedural confidence. Interesting. So the second position is procedural confidence, which we cannot service all our assumptions, but we can design procedures. Scientific method, democratic deliberation, adversarial legal process that are robust to individual blind spots. The procedure is the solution. This position is more useful than radical skepticism, but it overstates what procedures can do. Procedures are themselves designed by people with assumptions, and the assumptions embedded in the design are often the hardest to see. The scientific method, for instance, contains assumptions about what counts as evidence, what counts as replication, what counts as meaningful result. These assumptions have been productive, but they are not invisible, and they have been challenged by feminist epistemology, by post-colonial science studies, by the replication crisis. Interesting, like we talked about with people doing the identity stuff at a surface level, which is necessary anyways, because coherence really does seem to drive the whole thing, but people need something they can copy that allows them to live. Like, that's awesome. In ways that reveal genuine blind spots in the procedure itself. Oh, cool. Interesting. The failure of both positions points towards the same conclusion. The problem of hidden assumptions is not solvable from any single interior position. I agree. It has to be solved intuitively, passing this from the intuitive space through nonsense, which is where the Joker lives, as anxiety first about what the future will be, and then when the future arrives and it's more visible and understandable, we feel a sense of joy. The Joker then emerges as that and moves all this intuitive stuff over into logical land. It's pretty straightforward what happens. So what has been tried? The history of intellectual practice is in part a history of attempts to construct the outside that the single interior positions cannot provide. Several of these attempts are worth examining at the mechanistic level. Interesting. All right. So, adversarial dialogue. Awesome. It's most effective against assumptions that are already partially visible to someone. Yeah, I like a Socratic approach, just emerging biases. There's no need to be right in that that kind of context. It says at the bottom, the assumptions that are invisible to the entire community, the ones embedded in shared premise of the field, the culture, the historical moment, survive adversarial dialogue intact. Very good. Yeah, because you can't see them. They're totally blind. So, temporal distance is a less deliberate but more often effective technology. Assumptions that were invisible to a generation frequently become invisible to the next one, not because the later generation is smarter, but because circumstances have changed and the assumption has stopped working. The limitation of temporal distance as a technology is obvious. It works retrospectively after the consequences have arrived, which is often too late. Interesting. It works retrospectively after the consequences have arrived. Yeah, so hindsight is 2020. And then you have that in the moment kind of gut distinction, which I do really trust that gut these days. So, structured encounter with difference. The deliberate exposure to people, texts, and traditions that do not share your premises is more intentional version of what temporal distance does accidentally. The mechanism is to create conditions in which your assumptions will be challenged not by an adversary within your framework, but by a perspective that operates from a different framework entirely. The limitation is that the encounter with difference is most productive when the encounter is genuine. When the other perspective is taken seriously on its own terms rather than processed through the existing framework. Genuine encounter is uncomfortable, and the tendency to domesticate difference. Yeah, yeah. To translate into terms that confirm existing assumptions is strong. Let's take a look at this again. The limit is that encounter with difference is most productive when encounter is genuine, when other perspective is taken seriously on its own terms rather than processed through existing framework. Yeah, makes sense. Just this is the idea of approaching wisdom, moving above or beyond metacognition and moving into objective design, if you can, if that's even possible. So design friction is more recent and more deliberate approach, building into systems explicit mechanisms that force assumptions to be stated. Yeah, this is like active listening and repeating back to somebody what they have to say, and you get into a more post-mortem analysis. Red teaming, assumption mapping workshops, structured devil's advocacy. These are like the loud American and Asian cultures. These are all attempts to make the invisible visible before the consequences arrive rather than after. Cool. The limitation is that design friction works better for assumptions that participants can imagine might be wrong. Wow. Yeah, because it becomes really uncomfortable. The assumptions that no one in the room can imagine being wrong are precisely the ones that design friction tends to miss. Um, I'm not sure. The assumption that no one in the room can imagine being wrong, or like I can imagine being wrong all the time. I approach that as like a default. So the superposition of knowing and not knowing. Oh my God, are we like literally bridging into it? So the quantum epistemology frame is useful here not as a metaphor but as a structural description. A hidden assumption exists in a kind of superposition. It is a simultaneously operative, shaping every conclusion the system reaches, and invisible, not available for examination or revision. Interesting. Yeah, fair enough. The act of naming it collapses the superposition. The assumption becomes invisible, examinable, potentially revisable, but the collapse is never complete. Naming an assumption does not eliminate it, it transforms it from hidden premise into an examined belief, which is a different thing, not a neutral thing. But not a neutral thing. The examined belief still shapes conclusions now with additional weight of having been considered and retained. The interesting question is not whether this superposition can be fully collapsed. It cannot, which is an assumption. But what shifts the probability of collapse? Okay, that's also an interesting question. But what does shift the probability of collapse? Which we, before I even met these guys, called this quantum collapse. What makes an assumption more or less likely to become visible? Several factors seem relevant. Consequential failure is the most reliable when assumption stops working and failure is visible. Cool. Perspective diversity shifts the probability. The more different perspectives in a system, the more likely. Okay. Explicit uncertainty helps. The systems are designed to express confidence levels to distinguish between what they know and what they're inferring, create more surface area for assumption spotting than systems that present conclusions without epistemic markers. Okay. Create more surface area for assumption spotting than systems that present conclusions without epistemic markers. Okay, awesome. Temporal review, the practice of returning to past conclusions and asking what premise they rested on, creates a form of artificial temporal distance. Ooh, fascinating. Okay, cool. Yeah, so consequences, make it clear. You want to expose yourself to a lot of diverse people. They have to have confidence levels. I do that with like kiss and dry systems, right? Do not repeat yourself or least over engineered kind of systems. It's very, very effective. have this baked into all your AIs. Make sure you're doing like a 9 or a 10 out of 10 confidence before you move forward on anything. The practice of returning to past conclusions and asking what premise they rested on creates a form of artificial temporal distance. Yep, I write all of my articles primarily just for me. If you guys are benefiting from them, awesome, but I do go back and look at those kinds of things, and they're a way to like leave little dots on the map as to where I've been. So none of these factors eliminates the residue. Yeah, that's right. Because when you go around people with certain personalities, I like end up walking away sort of more like them. It's very interesting. They shift the distribution. The genuinely invisible layers shrink, but it does not disappear. The question is whether the shrinkage is worth the cost. Okay. So what moves through the system? The second order effects of taking this problem seriously are not trivial. If hidden assumptions are structurally unavoidable, then epistemic humility is not a virtue but a design requirement. Okay, cool. Yeah, a system, whether, yeah, you got to be humble, right? You don't know everything. So, a system, whether an individual, an institution, or an AI that is designed as if it could be fully transparent to itself, is a system that will be surprised by its own blind spots in ways that are more humble design would not be. Okay? But it's designed as if it could be fully transparent to itself, is a system that would be surprised by its own blind spots in ways that are more humble design would not be. Interesting. Well, it's like planning to surprise yourself. So this is an interesting concept, often considered impossible, but let's see. So the practical implications is that every concept, well, I guess if you had amnesia, right, you could like tattoo answers on your arm and like a sequential thing that you could like somehow plan and tune that you would end up coming to these conclusions. But again, you just biasing a system of truth and then moving other things into the unknown category. So it's not a problem that we need to solve inherently. But let's get into this because I really respect this author deeply. So the practical implications is that every consequential system should have built into it some mechanism for encountering its own outside, some channel through which perspectives that do not share its premise can reach it and be taken seriously. Interesting. Yeah, because I've noticed in like most human groups, unless you're given permission to speak, you're not welcome, right? And that's a good protected mechanism. There's reasons for that being there. So this is implications for how AI systems are evaluated. The current dominant paradigm evaluates AI systems primarily on performance metrics, accuracy, fluency, helpfulness. These metrics measure what the system can do within its existing framework. They do not measure what the system cannot see. A system that is highly accurate within its training distribution may be deeply blind to the assumptions that define that distribution. Evaluating for blind spots requires a different kind of test, one that exposes the system to inputs that challenge its premises rather than confirm them. Yeah, it's some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Absolutely, right? If people really want to extend ourselves with AI and want machines to be an extension of us, we really need things like grace, like deep grace on both sides. You would hope machines treat people like you want them to treat your grandmother, right? So that isn't so much a embedding of biases, which will naturally cause an inversion and a paperclip problem. This is a union problem. So we get into that a little bit more, but union is the answer here for sure. So it also has implication for design of institutions. An institution that is designed to be maximally efficient at executing its existing mandate is an institution that has minimized the friction that would allow it to notice when its mandate has become misaligned with its purpose. Fascinating. Yeah. Redundancy, dissent channels, external review, and deliberating encounter with affected populations are not inefficiencies to be optimized away. They are mechanisms by which the institution can see it cannot see from the outside, from inside. The deeper implication is about the relationship between thinking and dialogue. If the problem of hidden assumptions is structurally unsolvable from any single interior position, then thinking is not primarily a solitary activity. It is an activity that requires an outside, another perspective, another framework, another set of premises to be complete. The journal entry and the conversation are not the same kind of thing. The conversation has access to something the journal entry does not. The genuine otherness of another mind. What could be tried for mechanisms for outside? Assumption audits as a standard practice before any consequential decisions require participants to state explicitly what they are assuming. Not what they believe, but what they are taking for granted without argument. The mechanism is not to eliminate assumptions impossible, but to make them visible enough to be challenged. The actors are institutions, teams, and individuals in positions of consequential judgment. The constraint is that assumption audits are only as good as the diversity of the people doing them. A homogeneous group will share most of its individual premises. Yes, birds of a feather flock together, and truth shall return to them in practice, for sure. So, the failure mode is that assumption audits become performative, a ritual that produces a list of safe and already visible assumptions while leaving genuinely hidden ones untouched. Sure, Lehman Brothers, groupthink, etc., etc. Don't say anything if everybody's getting paid. So, adversarial red teaming with genuine outsiders. The key word is genuine, not colleagues who have been asked to play devil's advocate, but people who actually hold different premises and are motivated to find the weaknesses in the existing framework. This is the logic behind external scientific review, behind the inclusion of affected communities in policy design, behind the practice of hiring people whose backgrounds do not match the existing team. The constraint is that genuine outsiders are uncomfortable to work with, and tendency to domesticate their perspectives, to hear them through the existing framework is strong. The failure mode is that outsiders are included in form but not in its substance, and their presence is noted. Their conclusions are filtered. The temporal review protocols. So built into every consequential system, a regular practice of returning to past conclusions and asking, what did we assume when we made this decision? And which of those assumptions have been since falsified? The mechanism is to use the passage of time as a technology for surfacing what was invisible at the moment of decision. The constraint is that the temporal review requires institutional memory, and the culture that treats being wrong as informational rather than failure. That's exactly what we want. So the failure mode is that temporal review becomes a retrospective justification exercise rather than a genuine examination of premises. Absolutely. The closer the truth it is, the more genuine the people are, the more comfortable they are, the more they desire lifelong learning. And that way we can see the preferences and therefore the ethics and therefore the incentives line up that way. If they prefer to be in that kind of world, they will adapt to that. So designed epistemic diversity, rather than treating diversity as a value to be balanced against other values. Treat it as a functional requirement for any system that needs to see its own blind spots. The mechanism is to design teams, institutions, and AI training pipelines with explicit attention to premise diversity. Beautiful. This is what we're working on. Not just demographic diversity, but diversity of frameworks, traditions, and ways of knowing. The constraint is that premise diversity is harder to measure than demographic diversity and easier to fake. The failure mode is that diverse participations are present, but their premises are not. The institution has the form of diversity without epistemic function is supposed to serve. Interesting. The institution has the form of diversity without epistemic function is supposed to serve. Interesting. Okay. Fascinating. So diverse participation needs to be present, and so should their premises. So the question that remains, the thought that prompted this issue ends with an observation we're sitting with. Awareness arises not inside a single perspective, but in the contact between perspectives. The question does not get solved. It gets worked in dialogue. And each pass surfaces a layer that was previously invisible, while quietly generating new ones underneath. This is not a consolation prize. It is a description of how the problem actually moves. The goal is not to reach a state of full transparency. I agree. Perfection, not achievable. That state does not exist for any thinking system, human or artificial. I agree. And if you guys want to see on the blog, I wrote an article called Eternal Code. Just feel free to find it. I'll try to put a link in the description below. So the goal is to build and maintain the conditions under which the invisible layer can keep shrinking. Genuine dialogue, getting closer to truth. Yes, genuine dialogue, design diversity, temporal review, the willingness to be surprised by one's own conclusions. Wow, that is so cool. So what remains unresolved is the question of who bears the cost of building those conditions. Genuine dialogue is slower than monologue. Design diversity is more expensive than homogeneity. Temporal review requires institutional memory that is costly to maintain. The outside perspective is uncomfortable. The systems that most need to see their blind spots are often the systems that are most efficient at excluding the mechanisms that would allow them to do so. The question, what am I assuming that I don't know I am assuming? Cannot be answered from the inside, but it can be asked repeatedly in the presence of people who do not share your premises. That is not a solution, it is a practice, and the practice is, as far as anyone has found, the closest thing to a solution that exists. What am I assuming that I don't know I'm assuming? So I believe now that there's something in this moment that I don't know, but now I know that I don't know it. And so as the whole distribution of knowledge breaks down, I know a certain amount, a very small percentage. I know that I don't know a certain amount, which this new thought is now in that group. And there's this huge part of what I don't know, I don't know. And somehow intuitively, all that I don't know stuff, my body seems to sense a lot of that. And if I listen to my gut, I can have a convergence of intuition and logic. That seems like the best way to form discernment, and that takes experience and repetition, moving that stuff into muscle memory, which I think would be a very tangible way to describe intuition. If you really enjoyed this kind of stuff, we really need to help people with better decision making in the world. That's a deep thing for us, and for them, that's just more joy in their life, better relationships, better negotiating, better collaborating with others. And the thing that we're doing is called Project Surfboard in the US and other countries right now, and we'd love to potentially collaborate with you. This kind of decision making structure is what has been the work of my life, and looking at the utility that we generate through different activities. So I really have enjoyed working with all of you today here, and thank you so much for your time. And we will talk with you guys soon. Subscribe, share this with somebody who you know wants to work on their own decision making, wants better behavior, better relationships, and better utility of their own life. Hopefully, each of you are enjoying your life and really finding joy in your practice. Truly, like it says, it's a practice, and the practice is, as far as anyone has found, the closest thing to a solution that exists. This is in several spiritual texts. This is in other things. But imagine that nirvana is the feeling of music, and you're trying to catch that in your hand. Good day, everyone.